Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phase 3. Previously, we worked on enhancing our world scene by making some updates to our camera. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links to the video description, to the source code up to this point, as well as complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up, so let's get started. Alright, so the next thing we need to do in our scene is we need to go ahead and add in logic for checking for collisions. So currently we have our logic for allowing our player to move around, but there's nothing stopping our player from moving through the game objects in our scene or from moving off the edge of our screen. And so what we want to do is we need to go ahead and add in logic to basically tell us where our player can walk in our level. And to do this, we're going to be using our data from tiled to know where our player can actually move in our scene. And so tiled is going to be our level editing software that we'll be using for creating our level. And we've not quite done that yet, but what we're going to do is we're going to get the logic in place for handling our collisions. And then we'll cover tiled in a later video, and we'll be going over how we actually create that data. And so basically, we're going to have an export from tiled, which is just a JSON file that has all of the metadata for our scene, and part of that metadata is our collision data. And so to go ahead and do this, what we need to do is we need to load in some new assets into our game. So what we'll do is we'll come to our asset keys, and what we're going to do is we are going to update our world asset keys, and we're going to add a few new properties. So the first thing we're going to go ahead and do is we'll copy our world background, we'll paste it a few times, and we'll go ahead and add in our values. So we're going to have world, and we'll have our main level. And so this is going to be the JSON file that we're going to be loading itself. And then we're going to have world collision. And so this is going to be an asset we're going to be using for placing into our scene so we can debug our collision layer so we can actually see it. And then finally, we're going to have world and we're going to have foreground. And what this is going to be an additional image that's going to indicate where our player can walk behind game objects. And then that way we have some depth in our game. And then what we'll do is let's go ahead and update our values to match our keys. And then we're going to jump over to our preload scene. And so now we need to go ahead and load in these assets. So what we'll do is we're going to come to where we load in our world assets. Let's go ahead and copy this and paste it a few times. Then we're going to go ahead and load in our tile data. So to do this, we're going to use a method called tilemap tile.json. And what this does is this is going to tell Phaser that we're loading in a JSON file that was exported out from tiled. And then Phaser, the engine, will know how to parse that data and use it later on to go ahead and interpret our data from tiled to create our game objects and our layer data in our game. And so what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and do world main level, and then we need to go ahead and update our path. And so this is going to actually be under our assets, and it's going to be under data, and then our level.json. Then we want to go ahead and add in our other two images. So we're going to have world collision and world foreground. And so this is going to be our collision PNG. And then this is going to be our level foreground PNG. And so all these assets we added in earlier when we initially created our world scene. All right, so now that we've added in our assets, what we actually need to do is we need to use this data inside our scene. So what we're going to do is let's jump over to our world scene. And the first thing we'll do is we'll come to our create method. And after we update our player and we go ahead and add in our camera, what we're going to do is we're going to add in a new image game object, and this is going to be our foreground. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy this line of code for where we add in our background, and we'll go ahead and add in our foreground. So we just need to update our key. So this is going to be world foreground, and we'll keep the same origin in the same position. And so what this is going to do in our level is we're going to place another game object in our scene. And if we just actually open up our images real quick, we can take a look at that. So if we go into our map and we go into our foreground, we're going to see this is a very empty image. And all it is this is just the top parts of some of our game assets. And then that way in our scene, when our player moves, those assets are going to be rendered on top of our player since it's higher in the rendering order. And this just gives us some depth in our game, and it kind of brings our game to life. And so we do this for a few things like our housetops as well as our trees. And then that way it looks like our players walking behind them. All right, so now that we've added in our foreground, the next thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and create our collision layer. And to do this, we need to first go ahead and create a tile map in Phaser. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to come we'll come down below our code where we updated our camera, and we're gonna make a new variable. We're gonna call this map. And so for our map, what we're gonna do is we're gonna do this to reference our scene. We'll do make and to create game objects, and then we're gonna go ahead and do our tilemap method. And so for our tilemap method, this expects a configuration and it expects a property key. And this is going to reference the asset that we loaded. So this will be our world assets key, and this is going to be our main level. And so what this method does is this will go ahead and create a tilemap instance. And basically a tilemap and phaser is just a container for all of our tilemap data. This method doesn't create any objects in our scene. All it does is just hold the data that we pulled in from our asset, and it adds some utility methods for parsing that data, so then that way we can do things like create game objects based on our layers. We can create collision layers based on this data. We can add in our sprite sheets and our tile sets, then that way we could use that data to actually create our world scene. And so in order to do anything with your tile data, you need to first make your tile map. And so in order to do anything with your tile data, we need to make the tile map first. And so once we have our tile map, we can go ahead and use the methods that are available on our instance to go ahead and add our tile set images and to go ahead and create tile map layers. And so your tile map layer is just a phaser representation of our layers that we create in tile. We'll go ahead and cover that more later, but the main thing is we need to actually create this tile map layer in order to create our collision layer. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is to create our collision layer, we're going to go ahead and make a new variable. We're going to do const, we'll do collision layer, and what we'll do is we're going to reference our map instance, and then we're going to call the create layer method. And so the create layer method, the first thing it expects is a layer ID or the name of your layer that you provided in tiled. So ours is collision, and basically what this refers to is if we open up our level JSON file, there is going to be a layer in here that has this name. And so you see we have this tile layer and it has this collision. So what phaser is going to do, it's going to use these names to go ahead and create the IDs for the layers on our map. And so it's going to use this value here we provide to match it to this data here. And so then after we create our ID, we need to go ahead and provide our tile set. For the time being, we're going to go ahead and do an empty string. But basically your tile set can be used to go ahead and render out this layer to your scene. And so in tiled, on your layer, if you use any tiles, if you want to draw those in your phaser game, you need to provide the same tile set here that was used, so then that way phaser knows which sprite to draw to an individual tile. So like I said, for now we'll do an empty string, and then we need to go ahead and provide our position of where we want to place this layer in our world. And so we're gonna go ahead and do 0, 0 because in our tile data, this layer aligns with our current image that we're using for our background. So we'll use 0, 0 for our coordinate. All right, and then what we're going to do next is we're just going to have an if statement, and we're going to check that we actually have our collision layer. So if you provide a name that doesn't exist, your layer won't actually get created. And so we're just going to make sure that our collision layer gets created properly, because we actually need that for our game to function properly. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to copy our log statement here from our create method. We're going to place that inside our if statement, and what we'll do is we are going to change this to create. And we're going to say encountered error while creating collision layer using data from tiled. Then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and return early. And so the reason we're doing this is, like I said, we actually need this collision data for our game to work properly. And if something goes wrong, we shouldn't continue with our game. We're just going to go ahead and exit. All right, so now we've created our layer. What we need to do is we actually need to go ahead and create our tile set, so that way we can go ahead and pass it to our create layer method. And so to go ahead and do that, what we're going to go ahead and do is make a new variable. We're going to call this collision tiles, and we're going to set it equal to map. So we're going to reference our tile map that was created, and we're going to call the add tile set image method. And so what this method does, it allows you to provide the name of your tile set, which needs to match the tile set that's used in your level JSON file. And so for ours, this is going to be collision but it's going to be collision with a small c. And then we need to go ahead and pass in our asset key to where Phaser should go ahead and get this asset data from. And so this is going to be our tileset image that was used in the tiled program. And so this is going to be our world asset keys, and this is going to be our world collision image. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add another if statement, and we're going to check to make sure our collision tiles was created properly. For our error message, we'll do encounter error while creating collision tile set using data from tiled. And we'll go ahead and return early if that data is not working. Then so once we have our tile set, what we can do is we can update our reference in our create layer to say, hey, this is the tile set that was used in the creation of this layer. And now Phaser is going to know to go ahead and use that tile set to render out this layer to our scene. However, when our scene starts, nothing appears, and the reason for that is currently we are drawing our world background over our whole scene. So anything that was below it isn't going to be visible. And so what we can do is if we take our game object for our collision layer, like our other game objects, we can go ahead and call the set depth method to determine where this object should be rendered. And we're going to go ahead and set it to 2, so then that way this will have a different depth than our other assets. And now what we'll see is when our scene loads, we can now see our red areas here of where we have our collision data in our scene. All right, so what we're going to do next is we're going to make it configurable so we can actually turn the visibility for this layer on and off. So in our final game, we won't actually want to see our collision layer data. Instead, we would want to go ahead and hide this. And so since it's just a game object, we can go ahead and use the set alpha method. And so what we're going to do is we're going to call set alpha, and we're going to reference a new variable. And we're going to call this tiled collision layer alpha. And what we'll do is we're going to place this inside our config, and then we'll go ahead and pull that value from there. So we're going to do export const, and we'll do our tiled collision layer alpha. And for now, we're going to set this to 0.7. And then that way we can use it while we're testing and building on our level. And now what we should be able to go ahead and do is if we go ahead and fix our import, we'll go ahead and save. And now we can see through some of our game objects. And if for our config, if we go ahead and set this to 0, it's not visible to the player. All right, so now we can actually see our layer is visible in our game. We actually need to go ahead and pass this to our character class, and then that way we can add in our logic for checking for collisions. And so what we'll do is let's go ahead and open up our character class. So we'll come to world characters and we'll go character.js. The first thing we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and add a new property for our collision layer. So let's go ahead and copy this here. We're going to go ahead and paste it. But then for our type, this is going to be a Phaser tilemaps tilemap layer. And we'll go ahead and update the property name to be collision layer. All right, so we're going to go ahead and make this optional. And then that way, for any character we create, if we provide it, we're going to check for collisions between the collision layer and that game object when it moves. If we don't provide it, then we won't do that check. So then what we're going to need to do is we need to go ahead and add that property to our class. So let's go ahead and add in collision layer. And what we'll do is we're just going to copy this, go ahead and paste it here. And then for our type, we'll go ahead and just copy our Phaser type here. And we'll go ahead and paste that. And then let's come down to our constructor and we'll go ahead and add that in. So we'll do this. So we'll do this. Our collision layer is going to be equal to our config collision layer. And since this is optional, we're going to go ahead and also add in that this could be undefined. So to add in the logic for actually checking to see if there's a collision, what we're going to do is we're going to come down to our method for checking for block tiles. And so currently we have a to do, and let's go ahead and remove that. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is we need to go ahead and take the direction that was provided by the player and grab the tile that is in that direction and then check to see if a tile exists on our collision layer. So as an example, right now in our scene, if I press the up key, what I'm going to want to do before our player moves is I want to grab that tile that exists right above my player. And so I'm going to need the position of where we want to move so we can do that check to see if a tile actually exists there. Versus if we go like right, I would want to grab a tile here, and if it doesn't exist, we need to know that so we can say, hey, the player can move here. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and make a new variable. So we'll do const, and we're going to do target position. And for our target position, we're just going to go ahead and copy our current target position that's on our character instance. And then we're going to go ahead and use our get target position from game object position and direction method from our utils class to go ahead and get that updated position. So we'll do const and we'll do updated position, and we're going to set that equal to get target position, and we'll pass in our target position, and we'll do the direction that is currently set for our character instance. And now once we have this position, we need to check that on our tile map. And so to do that, we're going to go ahead and make a new method. So what we'll do is we're going to return this, and we'll do does position collide with collision layer, and we're going to go ahead and pass in that updated position. So then we'll come to the bottom of our class. Let's go ahead and add in this new private method. All right, and so we're going to expect our position to be provided, so we'll go ahead and add that in. And then the first thing we're going to check is we're going to make sure we actually have our collision layer. Since it's optional, we want to make sure it actually exists. If it doesn't, we're just going to say false. And so if there is no collision layer, there'll never be a collision. And if it does exist, what we want to do is get our x and y values from the provided position. So our position will be a coordinate. So we're just going to grab the x and y values, and we'll grab those from position that was provided. And then so what we need to do now is we actually need to see if a tile exists on our tile map. So to do that, we'll make a new variable, we'll do const tile, and we'll set it equal to our collision layer. And then we're going to call the get tile at world xy. And what this method does is this allows you to provide an x and y coordinate in your phaser scene, and what it will do is it's going to return a tile if one actually exists at that position. If one does not exist, it's going to return null. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to pass in that x and y value from the position we want to check. And then you can provide an additional argument here if we want to return non-null. And so by default, you'll get null if a position doesn't exist, but if we pass this to be true, and so what this will do is this is going to make sure that this method always returns a phaser tile. And basically what's going to do is on that tile, there's an index property that will tell us the index of the tile that was used in that position. And if it doesn't exist, it's going to set it to -1. And so we can just check for that. And so what we can do, we go ahead and return our tile, our index, since we know it'll always come back, and we'll say -1. And so if we want to go ahead and test, what we need to do is we actually need to come back to our world scene, and we need to update our player instance to go ahead and pass in our collision layer. So let's go ahead and add in that property on our configuration, and we'll reference our collision layer that we created. And so if we come back to our scene to test, we'll see right away if we press up, our character will face that direction, but it does not move through that game object. And so we can see that our collision checks are working. And so if we go to anywhere where we have our red boxes in our scene, our player should not be able to move through them. And so just to kind of see what's actually happening here, so we come back to our character class, let's go ahead and add a console log, and we're going to go ahead and console log the tile that's being returned in our logic. So then if we press the up key, what we should see is we get back this tile object here. And so the tile object has a bunch of properties on it, but the one we're really interested in is going to be the index. And so on this property, if we go to our index, we see we have this number here, and it's 189. And what this references is this is going to be the index of one of the tileset images that was used in tiled. And so as long as there's an actual tile in that spot, we'll have an index value come back. Versus if we move to a direction where we don't have our collision layer, what the index is going to have is it should have -1. And so if we come to our index, we can see that. All right, so what we'll do is let's go ahead and clean up our console log statement. And real quick, we're just going to go ahead and add in our JS doc for our method. So for our does position collide with collision layer, we're going to go ahead and for our param, it's going to be a coordinate for our position. And we're going to go ahead and return a Boolean from this method. Alright, with that actually brings this video to an end. In our next video, now that we see how we can work with data from our JSON file from tiled, we're going to work on adding in our encountering layer. And so this layer is going to be where our player can actually interact with our grass objects in our scene, and it will actually trigger our battle scene if a monster is encountered. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.